So we have started recording. This meeting, as always, is scheduled for 60 minutes. As always, please keep your camera off and your microphone muted. This helps us conserve bandwidth, particularly folks that have limited connectivity or folks on rural internet or folks working off of mobile hotspots. So if you have your microphone on or your camera on, please turn your camera off and mute your microphone. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to raise your hand, put questions in the chat. I'll do my best to kind of take those as we go along. We will hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So we're going to talk, we have a smaller number of topics today than what we usually do. We are going to kind of review documenting compliance reviews, kind of talking about documenting our work in RC Care and why it's so important. We've talked about this for the last couple of months. We've had a number of questions and some comments about that, which I think are worth discussing. We're also going to talk about why we call the suspicious case report the suspicious case report. And then we're going to talk about different types of risk and why what we do as compliance reviewers is not just about the financial aspects of risk and why our jobs are really important for a number of different types of risk. So as always, when you're doing compliance work and when you mark a compliance status, please make sure that you're making notes in the case feed. So you're making case comments. That way, if you're in a region that has multiple compliance reviewers, your teammates can see what you're doing, but also other members of the workforce can see what you're doing, what the case might need, can tell, hey, like our friendly neighborhood compliance reviewer has been here. Sometimes regions don't have a great visibility on who their compliance folks are, and it's a great way for them to kind of get to know you through your work. And that can be a really good way to make connections. It can also be a really good way in case there's questions later about a case. When someone goes, hey, this is missing information, what's going on? If we can go back and say, hey, look, the regional compliance reviewer asked this question, documented that the case was missing this on this date, and they didn't get this information, then marked the case non-compliant. So like we did our due diligence in compliance, so that's not where the problem was. So it provides us with some additional kind of coverage if there's later a problem with the case. But please make sure that as you're documenting your work, make sure you're not using commentary that's like accusatory or inflammatory, but make sure your comments are clear. Like it's okay to say, hey, I'm escalating this case, or I think this needs this case needs more review, or I'm sending this to the compliance analyst team, or even that I've submitted a suspicious case report. Like those are all facts. Please really try hard to avoid anything in which we might be accusing clients of fraud or accusing them of some crime or making characterizations about our clients. I saw one actually yesterday, and the documentation was not from a compliance reviewer, but it was in all caps, and it accused the client of a number of crimes. And whether or not the client is guilty of those crimes is really none of Red Cross's concern. The all caps case note also had notes about the client's arrest record. None of that is germane for the casework that we do. So, in general, compliance notes are really good about that type of stuff. Just make sure you're putting them in. Another thing that can be really helpful, in RC Care, like our names are already associated with our comments, but it might be worth considering, like if you sign off with, hey, like I'm making this note and I'm Chris Davis, compliance analyst, or something like that. Consider it. Among other things, it's a way for your region to get to know who you are and kind of get to know you through your work. And that can really help build some relationships there. If you see any notes, we talked about this last month, that are in any way accusatory or inflammatory or violate client confidentiality, please let me know, like ASAP. We actually had a violation of client confidentiality last month, and so really, really appreciate having the optics on that, because we were able to take steps to safeguard any further risk to that client's protected information. So really, really appreciate that. Any questions about any of that? I know that's kind of a lot, but any questions there?
Yes.
Yes.
I was just noting that, if you go into your profile in RC Care, you can add that information, the compliance reviewer information, to your signature there, or to your name there. And then anytime you make a note, that will be your name and your role will show up.
Yes, that is a way to do that. Let me take that one for homework, Susan. I have heard that sometimes causes some issues on the tech team side of things, but let me ground that tech rumor just to be sure. And once I have like grounded that, I'll put something in the chat of this meeting, because that might help make it a lot easier for folks.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I don't remember what it was. They may have gotten it resolved. So I need to double check that. Thank you for that call out. So I am making myself a note to ping Allison and Jamie about that right now. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So now next, oops, sorry. Kind of a little blip there on my screen. So next thing to talk about is why we call the suspicious case report the suspicious case report. And so want to kind of talk about that for a second, talk about why we don't call it the suspicious activity report or anything like that. Pardon me for the blips, having some system issues. We've gotten a number of questions about this, about why it is called what it is and why we wouldn't call it something else. So this next slide here has a number of suggestions on it that we have actually gotten. I didn't just like make some stuff up. The name, the suspicious case report, was actually developed in collaboration, not just with us, client care, and not just us, the compliance workforce, but also in collaboration with the Office of Ethics and Compliance, and also with some of our business lines of business that work with volunteers, some of our lines of business that work with human resources, and also finance and treasury. So we do not call it the suspicious activity report because of the federal definition of suspicious activity. I actually had some folks ask me for a suspicious activity report yesterday, and whenever I get those, I try really hard to push back on that. So if anyone asks you for, hey, do we have any suspicious activity going on in our region, please try to push back on that, because that phrase has federal meaning. And that meaning, according to the Department of Homeland Security, is observed behavior that may indicate pre-operational planning associated with terrorism or a terrorism-related crime. And if we have to make sure that we are not mixing up our fraud mitigation and monitoring for potential terrorism. Like, we can't get those two conflated. So I call that out specifically because it's really important. And I know it may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but we have fraud investigations that actually go to Homeland Security. And so it's really important that we use the same language that they do, so we don't have to translate our words into their words, or heaven forbid, have a miscommunication between our two agencies. So please let me know if you have any questions about that. But if you hear somebody asking you about suspicious activity in your region, if you can, take the opportunity to please clarify. We don't call it the fraud report because most of the suspicious case reports we get turn out not to be fraud. Turns out just something looked kind of suspicious. It's like, something's weird. We don't call it the training issue report because not all of the things were training issues. Some of them are because bad actors tried to take advantage of the American Red Cross. Some of them are because another agency called us to report that they arrested one of our clients. Some of them are just because somebody got a suspicious number of calls that ended in a few words and then a hang up. Like, none of that is a training problem. And that suggestion came from someone who was thinking that the word suspicious sounded too scary. And so, I really want to make sure that we're socializing that suspicious just means kind of, that's odd. That's weird. Don't know what that is. It's a little suspect, but it doesn't mean we're accusing anyone of fraud or doing anything criminal or malicious or nefarious or even negligent. Somebody asked if we call it the suspicious RC care case and RC respond call report. I'm reading that and I can't even say it correctly. That is a lot of words. Then we got the suggestion for the bad actor report. And although I kind of chuckled at that one, not everyone really assumes that we're talking about people who are doing fraud when we say bad actors. Somebody thought I was talking about people on the television that were doing their jobs poorly. And so that's not like a really common language that everyone shares. I mean, it is technical language, but it's not common language. And it also isn't always accurate. Sometimes just weird stuff happens. The other thing that we get the suspicious case report used for is sometimes we get good news suspicious case reports. And I love those. Those are my favorite. They're excellent. Sometimes we get good news suspicious case reports where regions will report in that they had something suspicious happen, that members of their workforce did good due diligence, and that fraud was prevented. That doesn't make it not suspicious, but it's also not a report on bad actors. It's a report on excellent work by the workforce. Incidentally, when we get those, we share them up with the Office of Ethics and Compliance, and those are excellent stories to have. So excellent things there. Any questions about that stuff? No, that's kind of a lot. I know it's a lot of words. And I know this is a little bit more technical than what we've talked about in the past. I promise not all of our calls will be technical. So now we're going to talk about some different types of risk. And these are not all of the types of risk. These are kind of the big types that we deal with as an organization, not so much necessarily that we deal with as compliance reviewers, but the work that we do is relevant to the types of risk listed here. So we have strategic risk, reputational risk, compliance, regulatory, legal risk, kind of separated by slashes there. They all kind of get lumped together in kind of the compliance and risk management industry. That's why they're combined here, so that we can be aligned with our partners in finance and in audit and our other compliance partners out in the industry. And then we have information technology and cybersecurity risks, financial risks, and operational risks. So let's talk financial first, because it's the one that we all talk about all the time. So this is actual dollar loss risk. So when we talk about fraud, like us compliance reviewers, when we talk about fraud, we are most often talking about the risk of actual monetary loss. And so when we're talking about mitigating against fraud, we're talking about preventing that loss. And so we monitor for things that might point to vulnerabilities. And that's what has kind of driven those things on your dashboard that get selected for compliance review by folks in the regions for compliance reviews. This is kind of the big ticket, like, thing that we do, is try to prevent financial risk. Any questions about this one? Very quiet people today. So this one's kind of like very, very tangible. Like we can look at a case and we can say, okay, so this is a fraud case, and we either lost money on this case or we did not. So like a yes, no. And we can determine how much. We can count that risk in terms of dollars and cents. We can count that loss. Strategic risk is a little different. So this is any risk that affects the ability of the organization to deliver mission services. So anything that might affect the ability of the Red Cross to do what it does. And so strategic risk is like a big, huge umbrella. What we do as compliance reviewers, and I know we have some document reviewers and event reviewers and some other folks with us today. So what we do as a workforce in trying to mitigate against fraud and protect the donor dollar and look out for our clients and all of that collectively mitigates, we do a part of mitigating against strategic risk, because as we're doing our part, we are helping the organization deliver the mission. One of the things that I tell people all the time, that is one of the best, coolest things about my job, I'm not a client-facing job, is that folks in my line of work get to help people help people. And so, as part of the NHQ compliance team, we get to help make sure that members of our workforce are able to deliver the mission as effectively as possible, and in a way where they are not at some of these other risks. And that's just super cool, being able to make sure that they are able to operate in the best way possible. Any questions about this one? This one is kind of squishy, I know. And it's not something we deal with every day. Another kind of squishy one, but it's one that we do deal with, is reputational risk. This is like the 5 o'clock news kind of phenomenon. So anytime, and I tell people this all the time, anytime you make a case comment, think about what if it was read in court, or if it was read on the 5 o'clock news. And make sure that the words that you're using to describe the case, to describe members of the workforce, to describe clients, that you would be okay with it getting read in either of those settings. And if you can look at it and go, okay, yeah, just stating the facts, okay, cool, then you're gonna be okay in terms of this. You can totally state facts on a fraud case. You can say, I had one earlier where I said, documents appear to have been tampered with. It was accurate. The address was completely in a different font. It was utterly falsified. The document was clearly fraud. But, in that comment, I just said, documents have been tampered with. I'm moving the case to the NHQ compliance queue. And we have a suspicious case report from the region. And so I didn't have to say, like, the client is a bad actor. I didn't have to say that anyone did anything criminal or negligent. It's just, hey, this document has a problem. That way, anyone who looks at it knows, hey, like, take a beat before you do anything. And I also put a note to please contact me if there's any questions. So that way we're both making sure that the documentation is clear, but also reducing reputational risk. And, we want to be super, super clear. We also deal with compliance and legal risk. Oh, Elmer, I'll get to your question about the examples of strategic risk here in just a sec. We deal with compliance and legal risk, mostly compliance risk, all the time. So with compliance risk, this is the risk of things like audit outcomes. We want to make sure that our system of record, RC Care, is basically audit ready all the time. Because, we have internal auditors, we periodically are audited by outside organizations, and I never worry about audits because I know that what we do is we monitor our cases, we document our work, we identify when things go wrong, and we are adhering to our rules and regulations. And part of that is due to the phenomenal work of our compliance document and event reviewers. And so as long as we're adhering to our, of course we have to follow the law. I mean, that's kind of a given. But we also have to follow our internal policies. So if an auditor comes in and audits us and then says, wait a minute, you made this rule, Red Cross, about ID and address confirmations or the type of contact information clients have to have, and then you didn't follow your own rule, that is a compliance risk. Even if we did not lose money to like fraud cases or criminals or anything like that, that still places the organization at risk. And so that's part of why we have some of the rules that we have and some of the dashboard components that we have for ID and address confirmation, like checking to make sure that if intake workers use like a landlord or neighbor or relative or fire official, that they've actually documented the name or badge number and phone number, because that's what our internal policies say have to be documented. And so we want to make sure not only if that turns out to be a fraud case that we can get a hold of that person, but also if that case is picked up by an audit, that case is like audit ready, like that case can go to an auditor and fly right through an audit, clean as a whistle, no problem. Actually, yes, that is a great example, Keith. Strategic risk, undeliverable emails is a great example of strategic risk. Thank you. I hadn't gotten around to answering Elmer's question. The reason why undeliverable emails are a strategic risk is because fake phone numbers are too. Because if we cannot get a hold of the client because their contact information is bad, then we cannot deliver our mission of providing additional follow-up with our clients. We can't get a hold of them. If they're a shelter client and we need to get a hold of them later on, like we can't get a hold of them. If we're trying to do recovery planning for clients on like level 1 and 2 disasters, and we can't get a hold of them to do recovery planning, they may have been highly vulnerable clients. And we have missed an opportunity to help some of the most vulnerable people out there. I mean, because if they don't have an email address or a phone number, like they may be like not able to be in contact with some of our other like community partners. And we have an opportunity to work with them to get a trusted friend or a family member to be able to get a phone number for them to be able to use, or even an email address, so that we can build some of those contacts as we work through that follow-up process. So yes, that's a great example. Thank you for that. The undeliverable emails also put us at some compliance risk. So do the fake phone numbers, because they're not real, they're fake. And great segue, thank you, Keith, to information technology risk, because our agreement with Salesforce requires that we don't have a bunch of fake email addresses or undeliverable email addresses in Salesforce. And so those undeliverable emails put us at levels of risk and interfere with our ability to follow up with our clients. Any other questions about this before we move into IT risk? Thank you for that, Keith. That was excellent segue. So we don't deal as client care compliance workers just a ton with IT and cybersecurity type risks. We do some. These types of risks just collectively are anything that involve IT infrastructure. So this is like computers, hotspots, networks, anything, all of that is the IT infrastructure. Anything involving data, software, anything on the cloud, and credentials. So if you remember last month, we talked about dangers involving compromised credentials. So that would fall under IT and cybersecurity risks. We also have some risks here dealing with violations of confidentiality, because that involves our data that our clients entrust us with. And they consent to share, if they consent to share, only in certain ways. And so another thing to watch out for, just kind of generally, it's not something we really have a good way to stick on a dashboard or anything, but as you're reviewing, if you see comments that where somebody is commenting about one case in another case, that is a confidentiality violation, because we should not be talking about one primary client with another primary client. It's not okay. So if you see something, say something, speak up and say, hey, like, this isn't okay. We should only be talking with the primary client on their case, or they have given us a facilitator that we can talk to, but we should not be talking with a primary client on another primary client's case. And unfortunately, when we have case splitting, so that is having one family in which numerous cases are opened in an attempt to provide more money, we see that happen far more frequently than it should. Because if the family is really recovering together, then we will see comments actually copied and pasted. So be on the lookout for that. Even though it happens far more than it should, it is fortunately a minority of the time. Very slim minority, thankfully. Any questions about this? Very, very quiet folks today.
Hey, Chris, we're always quiet.
I know, and I always comment on it. I encourage discussion. And I always will. You'll know this. You know this about me. But I think, and I know this is like super technical info, but I also think it's worthwhile to know the why behind what we do, and kind of know, like, when we talk about the importance of the work that we do, to really understand like what we're protecting against. It's not just about protecting our clients, protecting our workforce, and protecting against the donor dollar. The work that you do is profound, and it protects against all these different types of risks. Elmer, would you mind coming off mute and saying a little bit more about that question?
Well, I was wondering, in the old system, we used to verify the event and the phone number. And the new system, as long as that phone number is listed, I've been accepting it. But should we be verifying that?
So in RC Care will say whether or not the email bounces. Now, in most cases, and we'll get to the phone number here in a minute. In most cases, an email bounces because it's not valid. And if you click on, and that's how it winds up on the undeliverable email part of a dashboard for the compliance reviewers. Now, as an event reviewer, I don't know if you have visibility on that. Let me find out, because I'm not sure. I will take that for homework, Elmer. Now with phone numbers, we don't have a great way to validate them right now, other than, and we didn't in CAS, other than looking for patterns like sequential digits, repeating digits, and things of that nature. And so that is one of the things that, and we're trying to, like, I'm trying to fine tune the phone number filter somewhat, because I know it is snagging some that are and flagging them as potentially fake where they're clearly real. So that is still a work in progress, but there's a fair number of them that you can tell that they're made up, largely based on things like a preponderance of 555 area codes. I know that there are some that really do have 555 area codes, but not as many as we sometimes see. We also, unfortunately, one of the other reasons why email addresses bounce. So if the email address is not like invalid, is every once in a while a client, if they swear up and down, like, yes, this is my real email address. So if you see that in a case where there's case comments, you say, hey, this is undeliverable, and you go to the case and like the caseworker says the client swears up and down that this is their email address, chances are pretty good that their inbox is full and then it's bouncing because of that. Dan, that is a good question. Yes, if there is an SMS history, then yes, I would consider that verification that that number is real. So if you go into the case and there is an SMS history, so if there's text message history in the case, yes, I would call that verification the number's real and valid. And my plan is to add some more adjustments to the dashboard, the report that feeds that component on the dashboard, to further refine. I've added a little bit more, but I'm planning on adding some additional things to that to try to further refine that down, because I know some of you are seeing false positives. Any other questions? Oh, Katie, Katie, do you mind coming off mute and saying a little bit more? Do you mean like cases, comments about other cases?
Yeah, thanks.
Just if it's like if it's a one-off thing, I think just having a conversation is probably good. Like, have a conversation with that member of your workforce, or depending on what your regional like communication strategy is between compliance and everybody else, because everyone's is a little bit different. You know, it may be worth going through your recovery lead or your RDO, or if you're in a place where they're just like, hey, just talk to the people directly, because some folks are in that kind of space.
Yeah.
So follow your existing chain of communication, but generally speaking, if it's like a one-off thing, I think just following that existing chain. If it's greater than that, like if you see a trend, still follow that chain, but like escalate it up. And
Okay.
and because at that point, if and we had a case like this not terribly long ago where the client, for other reasons, had actually escalated the case to the Office of the Ombuds at NHQ.
Oh gosh.
And so the case came down to us. And then when we looked at it, it was like, oh gosh, there's some other issues here too. And
Mhm.
so being able to kind of have that heads up is really helpful if there is a trend. But yeah, if it's like a onesie twosie kind of thing, just work within your kind of normal regional communication to try to get it addressed.
Okay. We shouldn't have it like stricken from the case or something like that. I don't even know if that's possible.
It's not.
Okay.
Which is part of the danger is that like once that confidential information is there, it's there.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so if something were to happen and a case ever gets like selected for subpoena or something like that, it's like, oh, so like
Okay.
if another client's info is in there, like we have just had to send that information like on with
Hmm.
a potentially like completely unrelated human onto whoever subpoenaed the information. And so that brings some additional risk.
Gosh, yeah, I bet so. Hey, a couple of months ago, we talked a little bit about having like a one pager for DAT, just like best practices, something that's really easy to digest and reference on the go. And I'm just thinking too, like for casework, because it's often the caseworkers who are putting notes in and stuff. I'm just wondering if maybe there's like a one sheet for different types of users. I know that sounds like a lot of extra work, but I'm sure they'd appreciate, more than the reminder, but like maybe a little bit of a reference document about key things to remember things that we can't fix.
Let me take that for discussion with some other folks because that
Okay.
kind of thing would require some collaboration with members of other departments. Like that's not something I can just say, oh yeah, sure, let's write a thing.
Yeah.
But let me take that for further discussion with some other folks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Hey, Tanya, you have a question?
I do. I want to go back to this splitting cases. We
Yes,
do
absolutely.
we do see that frequently. And to Katie's point about a one page for DAT and our casework, I know there's not like a formal necessarily best practice or guidelines on splitting cases. It's kind of a case by case basis. But are there recommendations for the DAT team when they go into a place and there's 4 people living together, but they are 4 roommates? Because sometimes we'll see them put on one case and then later it turns out we have to split it up because they all go their different ways. And then oftentimes caseworkers get those requests too, because one client has left the home or what have you. It would be nice to have some really clear guidance on this, which I know may not be possible right now, but we are seeing more of them.
One of the things, and this kind of another risk that we have, one of the things to do is really really lean into our definition of family. In most instances, not all, certainly, and I say this sitting in a college town right now.
Sure.
In most instances, most of the roommate situations that make up a good chunk of my community would not describe one another, even though they live in the same like unit or dorm room or community apartment or whatever, would not describe each other as a family. They're not going to be returning necessarily to living together. And so if we really lean in to that definition of family, like, are they going to be returning to living together? Are they going to be sharing expenses after the disaster? Are they going to be recovering together? like, are they going to be together moving forward afterwards? And like working collaboratively together, regardless of what that family structure looks like. That part doesn't matter. You know, really leaning into that, we are finding that using that and using the kind of what is a family really sorts a lot of that out. And if they are a family, don't split the case, because the answer on case splitting then becomes don't.
Right.
Then if they aren't a family, then ask them, are you all sticking together? Are you going to be together after the disaster? And then kind of let the clients guide. One of the things that we're seeing an increase in, which is highly concerning, is that we're seeing an increase in people calling into RC Respond, actually using the terminology, I am recovering separately
Oh,
from
goodness.
all these folks. Which tells us that somewhere, somehow, in some subset of places, we have folks that are asking leading questions
Mhm.
and teaching members of the community our terminology. And realistically, the terminology doesn't so much matter. It's like, okay, who's in your family? Like, because most people, if you say who's in your family, like most people will tell you. Like it and lean into that part is what I would recommend.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great, especially during the initial response and intake. If they focus more on the family
Yeah.
instead of recovering together, which can mean something totally different, that might clear it up a bit. So,
Yeah.
And then it's fine if we decline to split a case, right? If
Yeah.
the client is requesting that, because sometimes we do, typically we don't, but sometimes we do decline the request, but it feels a little uncertain.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I would say to use that judiciously, you know, make sure, like, follow the definition of family. And I think it will guide you pretty reliably. We know that approximately 3% of our households on level 1 and 2 events should be split. It's not a high number.
No, that isn't. That's a pretty low number.
And that includes the roommates. It includes the multi-generational households that really do have to split. Like, we want to honor and accept their need to do that. It includes the adult siblings that we're leaving together but have to separate and recover separately for work. Like, our program allows all those things, all of those situations. We don't want to disallow those things in our program. But we know it's about 3%. It's not a lot.
Okay. That's good to know. Well, thanks for the information, Chris. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Great discussion. See, I knew people had questions. That's why I asked. That's why I'm a pest. So now, moving in to operational risks. This is the last type of risk we've got. Operational risk is kind of a big umbrella, like a handy diagram here. And it's kind of the risk involving sort of all the moving parts. So we've got people, processes, systems, and external events. So this type of risk also includes things like theft. So like theft of equipment or supplies, like theft of CACs, which is something we hear about from time to time. So if you happen to hear of something like theft of financial instruments, please, ask, hey, has this been reported? Because many times it has, and that's great. We have discovered a couple of instances where it has not. So just ask the question. And so operational risk is a moving parts kind of things. And so this kind of encompasses like the training potential issues. This is like all the human factors that go into risk, kind of our institutional systems, all of our non-IT systems that we have, kind of just doing what we do with the people and things that we have just day to day. It's just the risk that is inherent to us operating. Any questions about operational risk? Now, this is something that you will never have to calculate unless you're like doing a risk assessment or something like that. But just in case you hear the terms ever, whether it's in a compliance call or you're talking to your regional finance folks or anything. So there's a couple of terms that we have when we're talking about calculating, like, how big is the risk? And a lot of it doesn't really lend itself to math very well because, like, how, like, quantify, like, put a number on undeliverable emails. Like, okay, we can count them, but like, how many of those folks would have followed up with us? How many wouldn't have? Like, the variables are pretty intricate. So the inherent risk, though, is the amount of risk that something poses if we do absolutely nothing. So inherent risk by its nature is kind of big and scary. So each of these different risk types have inherent qualities. So, like, if we just left CACs sitting in the middle of a room and never locked them up, that's the inherent risk of CAC theft, just leaving them sitting there. We do things to control against that, like we lock them up. So that is a control that we take for that. So when we look at how effective our controls are, we can then look at our residual risk. So to get to, this is the leftover risk. So the risk that we all deal with day to day, that just exists in the world that we're in and that we're constantly chasing and trying to mitigate, trying to detect and manage, and sort of the risk that we all interact with every day. And this is why in compliance, we're constantly evolving, is because there's this residual risk sitting here. And that is what remains after we have identified and eliminated some of the risk, after we have applied controls. So we have all of our dashboard components, we have all of our separation of duties, we have our other financial controls, we lock up our CACs, we have payment method monitoring, we have all these different things. Oh gosh, Donna, I'm gonna get my eyeball twitch. Mission cards laying out on a desk at a DR, that is an example of inherent risk waiting to happen. So residual risk, you just calculate whatever the inherent risk is and subtract the effectiveness of controls. So a lot of this is kind of theoretical, but the fact that residual risk exists is why, as compliance, and this is kind of, I think, a lot of the point of having this slide, this is why, as compliance, we're constantly evolving. It's why we will never be in a state of, okay, this is compliance, and we're just going to be static, because bad actors and perpetrators of fraud are always evolving too. So we have to evolve with them because the landscape of risk is constantly changing. And so we will change with them. And sometimes we will be ahead of them. Sometimes they will come up with something we're like, oh gosh, we have to adapt to that silly thing they came up with. And so we just work with kind of the landscape we're in. And so I know that sometimes it feels like, oh gosh, we have another change coming. And so I thought it was really important to kind of take today and really understand the why. And kind of like, okay, what are we fighting against? What are we looking at? Really talking about the importance of the work that we do. Because it's not just about protecting dollars. It's not just about protecting the workforce. I mean, we protect parts of the mission. I mean, that's profound. And kind of why what we do will always evolve. Because I know it can be frustrating sometimes. It's like, oh gosh, Davis came up with something else for us to monitor. What on earth? I get that. I do. But this is the why. Are there any questions about this? No. Thank you, Donna, for making sure admission cards were locked up. Because, yeah, it's a great example of applied controls and leftover residual risk. But having them locked up is a great control. Because then if someone wants to get at the mission cards or the CACs or whatever, then they have to get into whatever the locked thing, safe or trunk or locked office or whatever it is. Any questions at all? Any comments? So we are going to have like this slide on every single call, just to make sure that everybody kind of knows about the suspicious case report. And now we know why it's called the suspicious case report, but it automatically generates an email to all these folks. I guess I need to change my title because my title just changed. I forgot to do that. But if something is off, go ahead and file the suspicious case report. Make sure you notify your supervisor as well so they don't get surprised by anything. Feel free to use the concern connection line if you have any concerns about any allegations of fraud, waste, abuse, anything illegal, unethical, unsafe. You can use that online or by phone. One of the other pieces of feedback, not just, hey, exactly why are we doing this and what does our work affect, which is kind of what generated this. But also on our next call, we are going to talk about root causes of fraud. One of the pieces of feedback that we have gotten is, hey, like when we file a suspicious case report, we want to know more about what happens after that. So we are going to talk about the root cause kind of framework that the Office of Ethics and Compliance uses to really describe the nature of what led a suspicious case report to be filed and how we handle feedback and what we're going to do to improve our feedback going forward. So we're going to be talking about that. We will also talk about, not specifically because we won't be using client data because we appreciate confidentiality, but we will be talking about some recent fraud cases and talking about kind of their status and how we do with them. We'll also be talking about some suspicious case reports in general, not in specific, that have led to just highlighting really good due diligence. So just want to talk about those a bit next month. And if you have specific issues you want to talk about, please send them my way. I'm happy to include them. And I think that's all I have for this month. As always, please absolutely feel free to check out our knowledge base articles. And this recording will be on the RC Care office hours page. We have our own YouTube playlist under there. The link was broken, but it has been fixed. So this will be uploaded here in the next day or so. So if there is nothing else, I will stop recording and stop sharing. I will hang out for a bit in case anyone has any questions. But other than that, I will see you all next month. Have a wonderful day and a fantastic weekend. Take care, y'all.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris?